coming. My name is Anar Valiyev, and here's my colleague of Kavus Abushov. We are in the house that believe that freedom of speech is more important than religious sensitivities. Well, first of all, just to break some kind of the ice, just first of all to say that in reality, we don't look like the pictures over here. We're much more attractive rather than a picture over there. It's a 2-year pictures, and I don't look very attractive on that picture.
You don't have to.
Okay, that's true, because we're faculty, we can be ugly as hell anyway. Okay, this house believes that the ultimate importance of freedom of speech. We state confidently that freedom of speech should not be limited in any case, especially in the name of so-called religious sensitivity. Freedom of speech, or the right for freedom of speech, is one of the fundamental rights of humans, similar to the right of living, marriage, labor, or education. The right of freedom of speech is written in every constitution of the democratic state except theocratic states, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, or anything else. Article 47 of Azerbaijan Constitution states, freedom of thought and speech. Everyone may enjoy freedom of thought and speech. Nobody should be forced to promulgate his, her thoughts and convictions, or to denounce he, her thoughts and convictions. Moreover, Article 50 of Constitutions guarantee freedom of information. Everyone is free to look for or acquire, transfer, prepare, and distribute information. Freedom of mass media is guaranteed. So the question to our opponent team is, how can state guarantee Article 47 and Article 50 if mass media would be censored for the sake of so-called religious sensitivity? Today, in every corner, every people talk about Charlie Hebdo case, the massacre. Everybody talks about how brutal it is, and everybody talks about that, whether these people deserved it or not. But before going to that issue, I just want to bring your attention to the history of Azerbaijan that had the same Charlie Hebdo case, and nobody killed them, and actually we applauded them. It's Mullah Nasruddin Journal, magazine that was published in the early of the century. Unfortunately, I cannot show the pictures or satires or caricatures of the Mullah Nasruddin, but looking at this Mullah Nasruddin satire, you can just find out that it's actually what was much more provocative for the 20th century rather than Charlie Hebdo today. So nobody killed Jalil Mehmet Quluzadeh. We never said that Jalil Mehmet Quluzadeh made anything kind of wrong. And again, if not Mullah Nasruddin wouldn't be at the stage of development right now, similar to the same societies in the world. If his editor, Jalil Mehmet Quluzadeh, thought about religious sensitivity, we wouldn't be able to teach our children of critical thinking. So there's 3 arguments I want to bring forward related to this case. Freedom of speech is fundamental right of people. Bringing the Voltaire's words. I do not agree what we have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. This is fundamental component of liberal democracies. Look at the list of the countries that have limitations of freedom of speech for the sake of religious sensitivity. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Oman. Well, Oman is actually a good case in that case. And as Benjamin Franklin would say, freedom of speech is principal pillar of free government. When this support is taken away, the constitution of free society is dissolved and a tyranny is erected on its ruins. Freedom of speech and expression are extremely important rights. And in our country, we should have the right to express ourselves without persecutions from others. The right of freedom of speech and expression is the building block of our society. And if we forget it about this one, we will just get to the path toward autocracy or theocracy. The second statement, religious sensitivity is another fake term to justify the monopoly and oppression of religion. Religious sensitivity is a very controversial term. In 2001, 1% of Australian surveyed population claimed that their religion is not typical religion of Abrahamic, but simply called Jedis. I guess you know who are the Jedis, right? The Jedis are the knights from the Star Wars, and they say this is our religion. So it's a 1%, something around 200,000 people in Australia said that our religion is Jediism. So technically for them, Darth Vader, remember Darth Vader, right, is a devil, Obi-Wan Kenobi is a prophet, Luke Skywalker is some kind of the apostle. So if we take religious sensitivity in this case, so we cannot say anything bad about Jedis, we cannot make caricatures on them, we cannot make any pictures or even jokes about these 3 characters like Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, or I don't know, Anakin Skywalker, or whoever it is. Then tomorrow, a group of people can invent new religion and make Dr. Farhad Mukhtarov and Dr. Javid Gadirov either apostles or saints. And then we should stop the debate at all, since we cannot criticize them. This is religious sensitivity, right? So as a team, we believe that the religious sensitivity actually do not exist and used for certain people by a group of the people to justify violence, claim to the power for additional benefits. Remember 2006, caricatures on Muhammad and riots about that? January 2016, whole Muslim world erupted against caricatures. But do anybody know that when these caricatures actually were made public? September 2005, 6 months before the riots happened. So there's two issues over here. Either internet is very slow, that to get to the Middle East after 6 months, or that events were actually used by certain type of the groups to monopolize their attentions. And that's true. Look at the countries that were just using this one. Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Syria, Iran. So today and right now, maybe hundreds of pictures depicting Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, or any other prophets are made, caricatures are made and read every day. But do we see any riots now? No. Maybe we'll see tomorrow when the time will come, and those people who monopolize our attention will continue to use it. Third argument, last but not least, my colleague will continue on that, but I just want to get you more on political development. If we ever take religious sensitivity into consideration, political development will not happen. Remember who gave the power to the kings? God. So if you judge the king about his power, you're actually judging the God. So forget about any type of the liberalism, republicanism, Marxism, neo-Marxism, or whatever it is. Nothing will exist if we take religious sensitivity into consideration. Finally, we want to state that by no means our intention to hurt or insult the religious people or any type of religion. We just simply want to say that the religious sensitivity is just a simple fake term to make your argument very weak or just to take your attention away. Our intention is to explain that religion cannot be or should not be used opposite to the freedom of speech. In reality, religion and freedom of speech can coexist and find appropriate solution for future development. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks, and I now call upon the leader of the opposition, Dr. Farhad Mukhtarov, to deliver the next constructive speech of the round.
Thank you very much, the audience. Thank you very much, Dr. Anar Valiyev. I want to start with the fact that religious sensitivities, that's not just about some religion being, some religious people being sensitive. It is about hate speech. So when you say that media has to be absolutely unrestrained in making any type of remarks, then you say that what happened in Rwanda was justified, when a radio journalist were for months and years going on to establish superiority of one tribe over another, which has led to a Rwandan genocide. You do create the pretext for incitement of hatred. You do create the pretext for discrimination of one group over another. You do create the pretext for Nazism, for fascism, for any type of one group being over another. So that's so much for the freedom of media. Journalists have as much responsibility as any other members of public. Your other argument is about Mullah Nasruddin. This is an argument that is close to our hearts. This is satire and political criticism. And I fully agree that we need freedom of speech when it comes to matters of political deliberation. This is what is democracy. This is what we stand for. At the same time, Mullah Nasruddin didn't challenge the minorities, didn't challenge the marginalized groups. They challenged the establishment. They challenged the government. They challenged the institution which was in power, which was then Islam, or which was then the Tsarist government, and so on. Now, we're talking about Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, who says, and he enjoys 21% of electorate, he says that Islam is a military, violent religion. There is no place for Islam in Europe. All Muslims have to be deported from Europe. This is incitement of hatred. What happened following that, Anders Breivik in Norway has written a manifesto giving his allegiance to Geert Wilders' philosophy, went on to kill 88 people, claiming that this is justified, there's no place for Muslims in Europe. Incitement of hatred, hate speech is not freedom of speech. Going on your other argument is that, well, if we have no freedom of speech, we will have tyranny, we will have dictatorship, we will have the end of progress. Look at Germany. Is Germany a tyranny? Is Germany a dictatorship? But Germany has very clear protection against hate speech. You cannot go and say there is no Holocaust. Try and deny Holocaust in Germany. It's a criminal offense. And not because you want to protect some feelings or sensitivities of Jews. No. The reason is different. Because the history has shown that Jews have been persecuted in this part of the world, and if you create a discourse or a pretext for that to be accepted or denied, if that becomes a matter of a debate, that becomes a matter of interpretation, then you create the pretext for the rise of neo-Nazis. You create the pretext for the Jews, for the Muslims, for the other minorities to be persecuted, to be killed, for the history to make itself repeated. You cannot accept this. So our argument is really simple. Freedom of speech is important. There is different value to different types of speech. And political deliberation is high-value speech. Hate speech is not high-value speech. It has to be limited. It has to be criminalized. It has no place in society. If you take this argument still as not strong enough, then think about the consequentialist argument. Imagine you allow for all kind of opinions to be discussed in a society in all kind of insulting, discriminatory, inciting ways. What happens? You create polarization of society. You create the rise of IS. You create more militants. Look at the case of Israel and Palestine. There is freedom of speech, but there is no solution. There is a vicious circle of violence that perpetuates itself. So what I'm trying to say here is that do debate, but don't incite hatred. Hatred is not freedom of speech. It's incitement of violence. It's incitement of military aspects. And not just about religion, about anything, any marginalized groups. Think about the LGBT community. Think about the ethnic minorities or racial minorities. What happened in France after Charlie Hebdo? The numerous attacks on mosques, numerous attacks on Muslims. I don't want to live in France now because I will be, in the first place, a Muslim, and then I will be a scholar or a person. You create this type of discrimination, which is a pretext for further violence. Now, to wrap up this argument, or what we're trying to say, is that there's different value to different types of speech, and the political deliberation is okay, but going beyond those limits to incite hatred, to allow for discourses which put one community, one tribe over another is not freedom of speech. Well, that's how much we have.
I thank the speaker for his eloquent remarks, and I now call upon the member of government to reconstruct the side of the case, not to exceed 8 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to be shorter than 8 minutes. I've primarily got a few hypotheses here, and overall I think freedom of speech is a value achieved after 300 years of struggle for it at least. It dates back to the French Revolution. It's one of the fundamental principles of liberal pluralistic democracies. It's the principle upon which modern science, modern thinking, modern technology has rested. So limiting freedom of speech, freedom of expression contradicts Habermasian discourse ethics. What is that? So Habermas says that truth, reality, should emerge in the discourse rather than should be enforced by a power structure. So if you cannot debate something critically, particularly a social phenomenon critically, and religion is a social phenomenon, you cannot achieve progress. If you cannot debate reform of religion, as Martin Luther did, or others attempted to do, how can you achieve purification and progress? My colleague Farhad Mukhtarov mentioned that freedom of media can be dangerous. Yes, he mentioned the rise of Hitler's Germany and the writing of Mein Kampf, and Mein Kampf was a real result of the freedom of speech. Actually, Mein Kampf, yes, perhaps that was a result of the freedom of speech, but what came afterwards? That freedom of speech was banned, and there was no opportunity to debate Mein Kampf. What happened in Germany was the result of the banning, of limiting freedom of speech. Now, I have to agree that freedom of expression has its own limits. Sorry?
Should we give him a chance?
As a point.
Here's a point.
I just want to ask, did you just say that certain restrictions on free speech, such as in case of Mein Kampf, are justified sometimes?
Sorry?
Did you just say that in certain situations, restrictions on free speech, such as restrictions of circulation of Mein Kampf, were justified or could be justified? They couldn't be.
No,
Okay,
I
thanks.
didn't say that. What I'm saying is that Mein Kampf was written, yes. ISIS, what ISIS is doing, capital punishment is a rule in Saudi Arabia. Can you debate those things? Could you debate Mein Kampf after Hitler wrote it? No, you couldn't, because freedom of expression was banned in all these instances. Now, I agree that freedom of expression has its own limits. Of course, can you insult the president? Can you insult many others? Can you let somebody insult your mum, your parents, your child? No, there are limits. But these are personal insults. Yes, personal insults can be defined. Now, religious insult. What is a religious insult? How would you define it? Define religious insult. Religious insult is different. As I was debating this issue with my colleague, Dr. Babayev, this afternoon, can you insult the Pacific Ocean? Can you? Yes, you can. You can insult the Pacific Ocean. Isn't it the same logic here? So what would be the insult of religion? Religious thinking. And we need to separate freedom of expression from freedom of confession. Yes, groups should have the right to confess, to apply their religion, to think the way they want. But freedom of expression is a value. If we ban it, if we limit it, and as the great scholar Benjamin Franklin said, freedom of speech cannot be limited without being lost. Then we risk many things. We risk critical thinking. I remember on TV there was once in Azerbaijan a philosophical debate as to how the society should be organized. And you couldn't debate there certain things because religious people were calling and saying this debate should be banned. Is this what we want, or do we want progress, thinking, and in the Habermasian way, discourse, we determine what is true and what is wrong? Thank you.
Thank the speaker for his remarks, and I now call upon the member of opposition to deliver the last constructive speeches around. Here, here.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank our colleagues from the House for presenting a few, let's say, arguments in favor of restrictions, in favor of sometimes going even further than I would go in my argument in favor of protecting religious sensitivities. First of all, with regard to the issue of whether oceans have sensitivities and whether we can compare oceans to human beings, and I would say that we cannot say that oceans and inanimate objects could have the same sensitivity, could have the same dignity as human beings, and that is, I think, something nobody would question here, at least. And I thank our government for reminding us once again the reason why in certain situations certain utterances should be restricted and limited and how to justify this. And first of all, for bringing up the example of Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf is a work which is prohibited for a reason. And and here we go back to the argument which was presented by our esteemed leader of opposition that of course everyone knows that there is speech and there is speech. There is speech which is criticism. There is speech without which we cannot imagine the existence of pluralistic society of debate and restrictions on which would inhibit free flow of ideas and endangers the very existence of the democratic society. However, there is speech which has no value. Speech, the primary target of which is to denigrate, to deny equal dignity to certain groups, to certain minorities. The speech which is very likely and probable to incite violence and cause harm to innocent people. Such speech is restricted in each and every society, which we can call nowadays a rule of law and democratic society. This includes restrictions on hate speech, restrictions on incitements to violence and public violence. And that goes back to the first argument which was presented by our esteemed Prime Minister here, and that was the argument that constitutions and international treaties provide for the freedom of speech, yet at the same time all the treaties and all the constitutions also provide for the appropriate restrictions on the freedom of speech. Moreover, there are lots of documents which provide for appropriate restrictions on the freedom of speech, in particular with regard to offending what you might refer to today as religious sensitivities. For example, the conventional elimination of all forms of racial discrimination tells us that propaganda of racial discrimination should be restricted by member states. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court makes it, establishes individual criminal responsibility for incitement to genocide. It is this type of utterances, this type of speech, which has no value, which has no meaning, which should be restricted, and that would be the main argument, which was so it is this speech which has nothing to do with pluralism, which has nothing to do with science, which has nothing to do with progress, which has nothing to do with freedom. It only has to do with killings, murders, mayhem, discrimination, and destruction of minority groups. And this House believes that this type of utterances should be in due time restricted by law. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Briefly, I think my colleague misunderstood my statement. I think religion is a social phenomenon. It's not a human being. Is there any human who's called religion? No. So there is personal insult. There is personal insult. There I agree. Freedom of speech does not include personal insult, and you can define what personal insult is. But religious insult, then yes, we'll have too many insults. And in that sense, religion itself is a noun, and so is the Pacific Ocean. As you cannot insult the Pacific Ocean, or you can, in a way, you can insult, that's okay, you would also be not insulting the religion. You would be debating it critically. And my colleague mentioned genocide denial law in France and in Germany. I don't think this is a liberal. This is more historic. I mean, this is related to the historic developments in Europe, that you cannot deny it, because there is the belief that the masses could still repeat it. But is that the reality? I don't think that's compatible with liberal values. The genocide denial law in the French Parliament, was it a good sign of a liberal state, of a state that believes in liberal values? No. What is important is that they should be in a society, as Jürgen Habermas says, discourse. In the course of discourse, you would be debating and determining the reality.
Question? Yes. Just one short question. Mein Kampf, ever it was written, I think back in the 1920s, by Adolf Hitler, was allowed in the United States. Meanwhile, this book was banned in Soviet Russia and later on in Russia.
And in Germany?
In Germany too, completely. Or let's say whole Europe. I just give it whole Europe. There are more neo-Nazi groups in Russia, in Europe, where this book was banned, versus United States, where this book was allowed. So how can you explain this phenomenon? Isn't it a freedom of speech that allowed this book to go ahead and just everybody can read it, everybody can make a judgment? But why in the country where this freedom of speech was banned, certain type of the books, there are more neo-Nazi groups?
I would just briefly remark that there are actually lots of neo-Nazis in the United States, and secondly, we cannot attribute the free circulation or ban of circulation of Mein Kampf to be the sole reason of the rise of neo-Nazis in Eastern Europe especially, but let's stick to the format perhaps, and I think there is a floor for rebuttal speeches.
I re-invite the Leader of the Opposition to deliver the first rebuttal speech of the round, closing the side out for the side of the opposition.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for our opponents and to the audience. I think that the debate has shown unequivocally that the freedom of speech needs to be limited. And there is no such thing as unlimited freedom of speech, because the right of one person stops where the rights of another person starts. So you cannot allow for the freedom of speech that incites hatred, that incites violence, discrimination, and so on. On the point that was raised by Dr. Kavus Abushov, is that you can criticize religion without criticizing religious people. I think it is nonsense. For a reason that religion doesn't exist without followers. So when Geert Wilders in Holland says that I'm criticizing Islam, I'm not criticizing Muslims. He is directly criticizing lifestyle and beliefs and the human dignity and the very rights of existence of Muslims and everyone who is following this religion. So if you are talking about religion, you're necessarily talking about religious rights. Now, I also agree with Dr. Valiyev, who says that the ISIS 1% of Australian population has the right to believe in whatever they want to believe. So it is contextual. You have to apply a limit to freedom of speech from one case to another. You have to exercise your critical thinking, ironically. Critical thinking doesn't go away with it, but it's still, you apply it from one case to another, but there is limits to freedom of speech. You cannot live without it. And the limits to freedom of speech doesn't kill critical thinking. I talked about Germany, I talked about many other liberal democracies. You have critical thinking, you have a political discourse, Jürgen Habermas, but still you have serious limits to what can and cannot be said. On the point that Anar Valiyev has brought up, that why is Mein Kampf not prohibited in the US and prohibited in Germany? For a very simple reason, that in Germany there is a risk of neo-Nazi being risen and Holocaust being repeated, whereas in the US the history didn't have put itself in the same situation when it just has to be protected, right? So Mein Kampf is not prohibited here, right? For the same reason. So, well, it is prohibited. Well, it's not prohibited in the US or many other places. So hate of speech needs to be, speech hate has to be protected, has to be limited. It's incitement of hatred, incitement of violence, pretext for discrimination. There's different values to different speeches. Political deliberation is very important. It's at the heart of democracy. At the same time, you cannot protect any limits to any types of speech. There is human dignity involved. If you start saying that Islam is a militant religion, is promoting violence, then has to be restricted, then you also restrict the human dignity of people who have the right to practice it. And there's a consequentialist argument that by allowing all type of offenses in the public spaces, you create more violence. Ironically, you do not promote dialogue, but you create alienation and polarization and resortment to violence instead of communicative discourse of Jürgen Habermas. You're shooting yourself in the foot. So I strongly believe that we have won the debate by presenting these arguments.
I now invite the Prime Minister to deliver the last speech of the round to rebuttal for the government.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the last speech. Well, there's a lot of students of mine over here who took research methods class, and they perfectly know that in the first class I usually talk about causation. I invite my opponents to come to my class and listen about the issue of causation. Because I believe my opponents misunderstood the concept of causation, A leading to the B. There should be a cause for something. When my opponents talk about Rwanda case, it's not freedom of speech that led to the genocide in the Rwanda. It's an absence of political culture. It's a volatility. It's a problem of previous government. It's autocracy that led to the genocide. And again, this is a causation. It's not a freedom of speech. Where is your limitation? We're talking about there's supposed to be limits of freedom of speech. But who defines limit of speech? Government? You? Religious people? Tell me, who will define it? So there's no kind of single definition. And any institution that will start to define freedom of speech or limits of freedom of speech, well, next morning will wake up with a decision to just change limit of speech in their own favor. Remember Animal Farm from Orwell? All animals are equal, and the next statement is all other animals, some other animals are more equal than others. So the same situation over here. Religious sensitivity. Certain type of statutes right now are really religiously sensitive for ISIS. And they're right now destroying it in Syria and Iraq. That's a pure exemplification of religious sensitivity because ISIS cannot tolerate this statute. So they're simply destroying it. Is it your religious sensitivity or not? So I would say yes, they will take into consideration this one. And again, bringing the case of the Mein Kampf, I still believe my opponent didn't answer the question why. Why in the country that has a complete full of freedom for all the type of the literature, for complete freedom of the speech, you can even go to church where the people, the priest, will talk about the evil gay people or LGBT community, how you shouldn't just tolerate them. Still, they just openly say that. So why there's nobody taking machine gun and just to go and destroy certain type of the editorial agency? Why they still, you mentioned this Dutch politician, why the people don't take it against Muslims? Well, because the political culture is different. So our simple statements over here, it's not freedom of speech that brings the violence. It's a different factors such as absence of proper governance, autocracy, dictatorial regimes that brings the problem to the society. And by this one, I will just stop my argument. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valiyev. And my brief comment to my colleague Farhad Mukhtarov, you can criticize something which is quite compatible with freedom of expression. You can criticize Islam, but you cannot insult Islam. You can criticize Audi, but you cannot insult Audi. It's obvious logics.
Yeah. You know, the Alice in Wonderland has this cat without a smile and smile without a cat, right? And he says, I have seen cats without smile, but I haven't seen smiles without a cat, right? So how can there be sensitivity without people?
Again, I think you can insult Muslims by insulting them, yes? Then we have to define what is there. And there we have to be careful in order not so that we leave room for debate. That is how reform of Christianity occurred. In the Middle Ages, you weren't allowed to debate Christianity because that was exactly what you were saying. In the Middle Ages, Inquisition period people who burned people were saying you can't debate religion because that violates the rights of people, the sensitivities of people. How many centuries did it take us to get
they didn't
Protestant
burn it because
ethics?
of that. They said that they burned them because they are simply wrong.
But don't you think that's the first step of saying, the first step of limiting, once you limit freedom of expression, that it usually starts that way? And yes, they burned and the people in France killed. What is the difference?
Why don't we open up to the audience for if anybody has comments, raise your hand and the faculty can moderate.
Actually, also maybe a disclaimer that views do not represent their own, so people, right? So it's just a... Yeah.
can you come over here and just tell your question because we cannot hear you. Just come closer. Whoever wants to just ask a question, you come closer.
It works, right? Ah, okay. So I would like to thank everyone who come here, and I strongly disagree with that human. I think that basically freedom of speech should be restricted, and we should not forget that there's 1.6 billion Muslims living in the world, and for them, Prophet Muhammad is not just a person; it's just an historic person. He's a person who has wahi. What's wahi in the Muslim world? Wahi is that he's the best of humankind. He has no sins in this world, and he was a person from whom Muslims get revelation. And so when now some uneducated people in Denmark and Holland criticize as a great person, they insult not only Islam, they criticize not only Islam, but they also criticize Muslims for believing in it. I just want to say that we should limit freedom of speech because, personally for me, as for a Muslim, of Sunni Muslim, of Hanafi Mazhab, I believe that Islam is a great religion, and some beliefs should not be criticized, or some things should not be debated. And last thing, I just want to think. You said that there is official religion in some states like Iraq, Iran. We should not forget that there's official religion also in Finland. In Finland Constitution, there is giving a little bit priority to Orthodox Catholic Christianity. And in Argentina also, so when we call about theocratic states, we shouldn't think only about Muslim states. There are also many states which with majority are not Muslims, but they have an official religion. That was my mistake.
It's your comments, fine. I mean, you have the right to express. That's what we said. It's a freedom of expression.
Did not insult anybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just the one correction, there's only 1 billion or 1.2 billion Muslims, not 6 billion. Okay, thank you. Thank you for expressing your freedom of rights. Absolutely, we agree with that.
Okay, I understand that the freedom of speech is more important than the religious sensitivities. I understand in all cases, but probably you know when the Prophet Muhammad died, and let's debate Muslims, Islam. But why we debate about Prophet Muhammad, who died 14 centuries before? And if we debate him, who will answer instead of he? He can't answer because he dead.
Thank you. I think that's a good question. Now, we have a lawyer, and he would also do correct me, Javid, if I'm wrong. But I think that's a valid question, and that would be a very good response if, let's say, instead of doing Charlie Hebdo, the attack, somebody would act on behalf of President and, you know, apply to court, take the case to court and say, you are insulting my prophet. Then the insult would have an option. That would be one option. Rather than,
that's not an option. Nobody has a standing.
Nobody has a standing in the court. If that's the case, but again, yes, again, if it's insulting against a personality, Prophet Muhammad, I would understand it, because the insult as an object. But if the insult, particularly if it's criticism and debate of a religion, there I think we need to have more understanding.
If you allow me, I think there's a difference between insult, which is an attack on human dignity, and incitement of hatred and incitement of violence, or calls for genocides, or calls for for violence, right? In this case, I think you could actually look at the cartoons of the Prophet not as an insult, but as a clear call for violence. So we're not talking about human dignity alone, we're talking about hate speech. This is hate speech, right?
And to add, with regard to the insult, you can insult a group as well. This is well known, for example, and we don't have to go to France for that. Very often groups are insulted, and for example, recently there was a case, even in a very theocratic Iran, where certain ethnic minority was depicted as cockroaches. And this is a very disturbing thing, dehumanizing a group. Yeah. It's not that I'm justifying Iranian government or in any sense, but for the cruel and inhuman punishment they inflicted on that person. But I certainly think that that utterance should have been censored at the outset. Yeah.
My point would be that we're paying too much attention to this kind of whether it's a caricature or whether it's a kind of satire. Remember 1970s or 1980s, there was a movie, Jesus Christ Superstar, or any kind of depiction of Jesus, Moses, or any other prophets. Well, but Vatican didn't call for crusade, right? Remember? Nothing happened. So the people thought about there's a lot of other problems, rather than to think about this kind of humiliation or just a kind of insult of the prophets Christ or Moses that lived almost 20 centuries ago. So the point would be, a really nice question to ask those people is, what would Prophet Muhammad would say for those caricatures? Wouldn't he love himself for that? That would be my point.
Can I ask a question? Thank you for your debate. I want to ask a question about the border. You say that we have to restrict the freedom of speech, yes? Then how can we define the borders? I mean, you say that we can criticize the, Islam, yes? Then you say that we can criticize Prophet Muhammad. Then the next day you will say that we can criticize Khomeini or mullahs or, I don't know, other people. How can we define the borders? Thank you.
This is a very good question, very fair question, and this is well known to judges this is known as slippery slope argument, that once you start restricting something, where do you stop? And there are various judicial standards, right? Yeah. But restrictions on free speech are clearly justiciable, and certain restrictions are certainly capable of being restricted by law. For example, one way is to set a standard that when an utterance creates in a given context a clear and present danger of violent response, then it should be banned, right? That's one example, yeah? So the way is usually it's a court comes up with a standard, yeah, and tries to apply it even-handedly. Yeah, of course there's no perfect solution which will automatically or mechanically define the limit, but the point is how that does mean that you should have no limits at all. So your argument seems to be is that just because limits can be pushed indefinitely, there should be no limits at all. This is something that we cannot maintain, probably, right?
I think I disagree with my colleague along many lines, but on one issue I disagree very clearly. The causal relationship between violence and freedom of expression is definitely not well established. It's definitely not. So freedom of expression does not lead to violence, does not lead to hatred. You can get hatred in many other platforms. Freedom of expression perhaps can be one platform through which you can incite hatred. But it doesn't necessarily. So Charlie Hebdo may be an issue of a critical debate, may be seen by some groups as an insult. Yes, the group is insulted, and if that's the case, there I agree with you. If that's the case,
could it be seen?
But just mere debate. And I remember when back when living in Germany, there was mere debate of Islam from a critical, interpretive point of view by a Muslim Islamic scholar, and he was pressured by the Islamic Council of Germany to step down, and he had to step down because he was told you can never raise any question. Our religion bans raising questions, which was incompatible with liberal values of Germany. So in that sense, I think there the limit is really, and as Benjamin Franklin says, if freedom of speech cannot be limited without being lost, what is the boundary? And the boundary is really dangerous. But on the hatred issue, I mean, particularly insult of a group, I agree with you. But I disagree that there's a direct causal relationship between Mein Kampf, somebody's speech, and instead enlightenment and Kantian enlightenment is probably the best solution to fighting hatred in a society.
There's been a lot of causality talk today, and today I had three lectures with my students when we were discussing exactly these issues, and I feel a bit weird now. But the question is how when establishing causal events, and there's the same effect is always brought about by plurality of causes, right? So we can consider utterances at least a contributory cause to certain events. The calls on the Rwandan radio to exterminate, cut the tall trees, how they were calling them, it was a call to exterminate Tutsis, and propaganda of violence and insults towards the minority group are clearly considered to be causal contributions to the extermination, and we may not say that this speech has the same value as discussion and a pluralistic discussion of scientific truths or of political criticism of opponents, for example. This is a different type of speech, and different standards apply to it.
But finally, I think these things happened in Germany and in Rwanda because the platform itself was not an open debate, it was a closed debate. Who could question Mein Kampf after Hitler rose to power? Who could question in a country where freedom of expression was strictly banned? In a country where freedom of expression is strictly banned, can you have a debate that perhaps something is wrong with that expression? I think these things actually happened because of the limit, because freedom of expression was banned.
Hi. Okay. I want to ask a question to the advocates here. Sorry. Okay. My question is for the advocates of unlimited freedom of speech. I'm basically wondering about the people who are living in the well-established societies in the European countries and who are they believe that religious fundamentalism is the way to fight with the developed societies. They sell this agenda, they promote this school of thought, but as people, they do not indulge in violence. They do not kill anyone, they do not really commit any crime. But as a consequence, we do see a lot of people getting convinced and moving to conflict zones, moving to Syria, moving to other societies where there are a lot of conflicts going on. So how would you prosecute these people? So you're talking about complete freedom of speech. So this is what they believe, this is what they debate about on televisions and everywhere. So how would you categorize them and how would you deal with them?
Well, complete freedom of speech does not mean complete freedom of responsibility. You have a right to say what you want to say, but there's a certain responsibility behind of that. If your actions can bring to the certain type of the unwanted consequences, and if your actions can just bring to the certain type of the crime, then you have to be kind of under the criminalized. So we are not saying that you can just say whatever, you can say whatever you would say. But simply, it does not mean that you are free from the responsibility of your actions. If you remember Shoko Asaharo, who was a famous cult leader in Japan, Aum Shinrikyo, he had a complete freedom of speech. But at the end, he ended up to just bomb Tokyo subway, right? So, but still, he had a freedom of speech, he has a right, but once he just closed or just to somehow trespass the borders of what is allowed or what is not, he was immediately convicted. So again, freedom of speech or unlimited freedom of speech does not mean that you're free from certain type of responsibility. I'm bringing back again another question to my kind of the opponents to say that how the freedom of speech or unlimited freedom of speech can help to stop the violence. I will just bring you to the period of the 2005-2006 when Iran, theocratic regime of Iran, announced caricature in response to the caricature of Muhammad, caricatures on Holocaust. It was just done just with the kind of the purpose to irritate the rest of the world. Yes, you know what Israel did? They completely did the same thing. They just like, let's announce Holocaust caricatures ourselves. And they announced it and just gave a prize for that. So they stopped the taboo on Holocaust inside Israel in order not to give additional cards in the hands of the people who want to use it. That's complete, exactly the exemplification of the unlimited freedom of speech. Let everybody to talk about it.
No, but the question was, do you think that propaganda of fundamentalist thinking, for example, propaganda of the IS, Islamic State, should be somehow regulated and restricted in the public sphere of democratic countries? Should the ideology of say, totalitarian movements such as Nazism, Bolshevism, which seek to undermine the very democratic society or the fundamentalist agenda, should they be restricted? That was a question asked, I think.
Thanks. I will answer the same question. I'm not just trying to propaganda ISIS or something, but let's people to decide what is good and what is bad. Yes, let us people decide. If George Washington or the fathers of American revolutions would have failed in the revolution, they would be called mutinies, right? They would not be called the fathers of American revolution. But they had a chance to do this. The same way, I'm not just comparing, again, ISIS with the fathers of the American Revolution, but let the people to decide. Because once you, as a government, as a person, as a website moderator, decide what to ban or what not to ban, the limits can be further away. Thanks.
And Javid, I think the best way to restrict ISIS is by persuasion. The best way is by... No, not only ISIS, any totalitarian regime. I mean, the best way to teach, what is that? By showing it. By letting the kid do it.
How can you show something if they don't listen?
No, you
That's in the Plato.
Therefore,
how can we persuade you if we don't listen?
Therefore, you have to speak. You have to speak in an attractive way. You have to make your speech interesting.
Yo.